All right, guys. So I'm going to kind of take you through this lesson today as if I would be there. This is a PowerPoint we would have used. I want to highlight some of the big parts of Unit 2, which is a very brief unit about the Spanish-American War, how we went to war with Spain, and ultimately how the United States became an imperial power. That's the most important part of what we're talking about. So as we go through this today, just a couple of notes. Again, the stuff in red is the most important things to remember. This is just kind of goes through the tale of how we expanded, how we were able to grow our territory, whether it's through war, whether it's through purchasing. The idea of the Louisiana Purchase, we've already talked about pretty extensively. We've already talked about the annexation of Texas with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 after we beat Mexico in the war. The idea that Russia sold us Alaska in 1867, again, a huge part of our territory that becomes part of us. All these different things are just worth noting and looking at just brief pictures of how much land we actually were able to gain as a result of it. And we did a really good job last week of describing the Louisiana Purchase and all that was to come down here for what once was Mexico. When you look at Hawaii, which is a little bit different of a story, there's a couple things I want you to understand about Hawaii is that they were an independent nation before they became a territory controlled by the U.S. This is their last queen. Queen Liliuokalani was her name. Because American businesses were kind of building their businesses in Hawaii, eventually the royal family and the queen didn't like that. They didn't want to have our businesses there. And the businessmen started to plot to overthrow her. And as a result, a guy named Sanford B. Dole was the guy who was probably the ringleader of the people seeking to overthrow her, and allowed for this overthrow to be successful. Dole then became a provincial president of Hawaii, as it was in 1899 annexed as part of the United States as a territory, but did not become a state until even after Pearl Harbor, even after World War II, 1959. So just remember that about Hawaii. It was an independent nation. The businessmen in Hawaii that were American sought to overthrow the queen, which they were successfully able to do, and it becomes a territory controlled by the U.S., initially led by Sanford B. Dole, who becomes the founder of Dole Plantation, Dole Pineapple, and Dole Bananas, a very, very successful business. In Cuba, this is where we kind of begin one of the bigger parts of this lesson, and what happened here is that Cuba, being very close to the United States, was controlled by Spain. And Cuba at this point was a hotbed of American investment and business going into Cuba and trying to invest in that country. But with the Spanish there, that becomes a little bit of a problem because they're the ones who control the region, control that area. So ultimately, the people of Cuba try to rise up against the Spanish, try to kick them out, and try to rebel. Ultimately, got crushed, and thousands of Cubans ultimately ended up going to concentration camps, ending up, many of them were ultimately killed because they tried to get rid of Spain. But in the United States' eyes, if the Spanish leave Cuba, then it's better for us because then we have more unintruded business opportunities to kind of invest there and sell our goods to those people. So what happens in the United States is that this mass media idea, in this case, newspapers as a way of communicating to large numbers of people, started to use a little bit of an exaggeration technique in Cuba about what happened. They were drawing horrible atrocities of what the Spanish were doing to the Cubans, and they were making all these political cartoons look like the Spanish were just evil devils, when in reality they weren't. But we needed the American public to believe that. And if they believed it, then they would be more receptive to the idea of any kind of intervention the United States takes in Cuba to prevent all this crazy stuff from happening. So the way it worked out is the people in the U.S. were sympathetic to the rebels. They were sympathetic towards the cause of getting the Spanish out. And the way this worked out is these two men, Hearst and Pulitzer, you have two competing newspapers. And in order to get readers here in the late 1800s, your news had to be kind of sensationalized. And that leads to what the term yellow journalism refers to as this idea that even though the news may not be true, kind of like the original fake news, it can be interesting for people to read. And if it looks interesting, they're going to buy your newspaper to read it. So even if it's not based on fact, it's still something that people wanted to read. And that leads to this kind of concept of very much untruth stories, stories that were not true. And again, the Spanish treachery, the Spanish hardships of what they were doing to the people in Cuba became the favorite topic of writers, and ultimately allowed for tons of newspapers to go through and write terrible stories about Spain because they wanted American sympathy for it. So understand that term, yellow journalism. It is pretty important to understand. And then ultimately it leads to a war, Spanish-American War. A couple of causes. The Delome letter is something that was sent from the Spanish ambassador to Washington that was not supposed to ever be read, but he called our president low and weak and a low politician and stuff like that. That apparently was a really, really low, I guess, or a really, really big insult in that era. And when the U.S. gets hold of this, they were very upset. And they said, how in the world could this person of such high diplomatic means to the U.S. be so rude to the United States president? That's a reason why we eventually go to war in Cuba. The second thing was our U.S. ship called the USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. And when it blew up and killed a lot of American sailors, people immediately claim the Spanish did it. The Spanish did it. The Spanish did it. And they say the Spanish mine blew up the Maine, and now we definitely have to go to war because they killed our people. The reality is that someone was probably smoking a cigarette too close to the ammunition hold and blew the ship up. But that's not what was reported in the media to the United States. We all believe the Spanish killed our people. Now we have to go to war. Now we have to go and fight. And these kind of causes here were very critical and important for the way this will ultimately end up, with the U.S. declaring war on Spain, 1898, which is what the Spanish-American War becomes known as. So this war itself, not a real big, long war. Ultimately, it lasted just a few months. And there are just a couple of points I want to make about it, is that we fought Spain everywhere the Spanish were. Whatever territories they were in, we went and fought them. We went and fought them in the Philippines. We went and fought them in Cuba. We went and fought them in Puerto Rico. We went and fought them in Guam. All these different places that ultimately they had control over. And as we beat them everywhere they are, a group of people called the Rough Riders, which was Teddy Roosevelt's group before Teddy Roosevelt was the U.S. president in the early 1900s. He led a group of Rough Riders in Cuba, these American soldiers that fought the Spanish, that fought the Spanish Navy, and ultimately crushed them, leading to Spain's eventual defeat and surrender to the Americans. And that's a pretty important thing to understand and remember about what happens here for the Spanish-American War. You see a couple of maps of different places that we fought them, and it is pretty interesting. To wrap the war up, the Treaty of Paris is important to understand the 3 points. This will be one of your non-negotiables of the description of the Treaty of Paris. Several things happened. Spain gave Cuba its freedom. That's one of the things that we wanted. They gave up Puerto Rico and Guam, and they gave up the Philippines, which the U.S. then paid them $20 million for. And Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines now become territories that the U.S. takes over. Cuba, we had the right, based on the Teller Amendment, which we saw up here, that we could kind of control some things in Cuba. We could go in and enact some of the things that we wanted to have happen. We could interfere, so to speak. But it was going to be something that was not used as often because we didn't want to necessarily be seen as someone interfering in Cuba. But Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were important for us. This Platt Amendment, to go along with the Teller Amendment, allowed us to, like I said a second ago, to intervene in the Cuban affairs and build naval bases, which is why we built Guantanamo Bay, which is the only base that we still have in Cuba that's open. And that was because of this amendment way back in the early 1900s. The amendment eventually will be gone and dismantled after 1934. So understand the Treaty of Paris, the 3 big points that are here, and what the Platt Amendment does is also pretty important as well. We'll pick up the rest of this on the next video.